The first thing my neighbor did after his fence collapsed was hand me a $4,200 bill and tell me to pay for it, like I was some kind of walking insurance company with a wallet attached. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't wonder why the tree that had stood there for decades suddenly gave up overnight. He just pointed at the broken fence, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Your tree, your problem." What he didn't know was that a few days later, I would be standing in his driveway with a report that would completely change who was responsible for that fence. I live outside a small town called Fairview Ridge, Ohio, on a quiet road where most people know each other's routines better than they know their own neighbors' birthdays. It's the kind of place where people wave when they drive by, where you borrow a ladder instead of buying one, and where everyone has an opinion about whose tomatoes grow best every summer. My house sits on a little over half an acre. Nothing fancy, just an old two-story home with a wooden porch, a patch of grass out front, and one massive red oak tree that had been there long before I ever bought the property. That tree was probably the oldest thing on the entire street. The trunk was thick, the branches stretched over my backyard like giant arms, and every fall it covered the lawn in orange and red leaves that made the whole place look like a postcard. I always joked that the tree was the real owner of the property, and I was just paying the mortgage for it. The funny thing is, when you live somewhere long enough, you stop seeing certain things. They become part of the background of your life. You don't notice the sound of the refrigerator until it stops working. You don't notice the old fence until it falls apart. And you don't notice a tree getting sick until it's already too late. The oak sat right near the property line between my yard and my neighbor's place. His name was Dale Mercer, and when he first moved in, we got along fine. At least I thought we did. Dale was the kind of guy who always had a project going. He had a perfectly trimmed lawn, a spotless driveway, and a strong belief that everything in the neighborhood should look exactly the way he imagined it. At first, I admired that. I figured he just cared about his home. But over time, I started noticing something different. Dale didn't just want his property to look good. He wanted everything around him to match his vision, too. A few months before the incident, he had mentioned the oak tree more than once. The thing drops leaves everywhere. He told me one afternoon while standing near the fence. I laughed and said, "Yeah, that's what trees do. They're not exactly famous for keeping things tidy." He didn't laugh. He just stared at the branches hanging over his side of the yard. "I'm just saying, something that big, that close to a fence, is asking for trouble." I didn't think much about it at the time. People complain about trees all the time. Too many leaves, too much shade, too many squirrels, too many birds. But looking back now, I realized Dale had already made up his mind about that tree. He didn't see it as something beautiful. He saw it as an inconvenience. Then came the morning. Everything changed. I remember walking outside with my coffee, still half asleep, expecting a normal Saturday. Instead, I saw the upper half of the oak lying across Dale's white vinyl fence. The branches had snapped through several panels, and the fence looked like someone had folded it in half. For a second, I just stood there trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed Dale already standing in his yard, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't confused. He looked prepared. That was the first thing that bothered me. He walked over slowly, handed me the paper, and said, "I already got someone out here. Repair estimate is $4,200. I looked at the number, then looked back at him. "Dale, we don't even know what caused this yet." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Your tree came down on my fence." I walked over to the broken trunk and looked closely. Something felt wrong. The wood inside wasn't the solid brown color I expected. It was pale, soft, almost sponge-like. The tree didn't look like it had been healthy and suddenly lost a battle with the wind. It looked like something had been eating away at it from the inside. I turned back toward Dale and said, "This tree was sick." He crossed his arms. "That's convenient." "No, I'm serious. Look at this. Healthy trees don't just rot like this overnight." Dale gave a little smile. The kind of smile people make when they think they already won the argument. "You can explain it however you want." the tree was on your property." Then he walked back toward his house, leaving me standing there with a broken tree, a damaged fence, and a $4,200 bill I never agreed to pay. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I started thinking about something I had almost forgotten. A few months earlier, I had noticed the oak looking different. The leaves had turned yellow earlier than usual. The ground around the roots looked unusually dry. And then I remembered something else, something I had ignored at the time. A few weeks before the tree finally collapsed, I had seen Dale standing near the fence line holding a bright orange container, pouring something along the edge of his property. I didn't know what it was. I didn't ask. I assumed he was just taking care of weeds. But now, staring at that $4,200 invoice under my kitchen light, I realized I might have been looking at the wrong person as the victim all along. I spent most of that night going back through old pictures on my phone, and it was strange how something that had been sitting right in front of me for months suddenly started making sense. I found photos from the previous summer where the oak's leaves were already changing color while the rest of the trees on the street were still full and green. I found another picture from early fall where the grass around the base of the tree looked dry and cracked, almost like it had been forgotten during a drought. At the time, I had blamed the weather. We had a few rough weeks with heat and very little rain. And honestly, I never thought much about it. Trees get old, storms happen, things break. That's just part of owning a home. But now, with Dale standing there demanding money from me, I started looking at every detail differently. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I wasn't interested in starting a neighborhood war. I wasn't looking for revenge. I'm not that guy who wakes up hoping for conflict. I like my quiet mornings, my coffee on the porch, and not knowing what my neighbors are arguing about behind their curtains. But there's something about being blamed for something you didn't do that changes the way you see things. It's not even the money. It's the feeling that someone decided the truth didn't matter because they had already chosen the person they wanted to blame. The next morning, I made a call to an arborist named Evelyn Parker, a certified tree specialist who had been recommended by a friend. I explained the situation, and she didn't immediately jump to conclusions. That actually made me trust her more. She simply said, "Let me look at the evidence before we decide what happened." A few hours later, she pulled into my driveway wearing work boots, carrying a clipboard and a small collection of tools that looked like something between a medical kit and a mechanic's bag. Dale was outside when she arrived. He watched from his porch, arms crossed, almost like he was waiting for someone to confirm what he had already decided. Evelyn walked around the tree slowly. She didn't rush. She touched the bark, examined the broken sections, checked the roots, and took several samples. Every once in a while, she would stop and write something down. I remember standing there feeling nervous because, even though I believed I was right, there was still a part of me wondering, what if I'm wrong? What if this really was just an old tree that failed and I'm about to look like the neighbor who refuses to take responsibility? After nearly 30 minutes, Evelyn stepped back from the trunk and looked at me. Her expression had changed. She wasn't confused. She wasn't guessing. She looked concerned. "This tree didn't simply die from age," she said. "There are signs of chemical damage." I felt my stomach drop. "Chemical damage?" I asked. She nodded and pointed toward the lower section of the trunk and the roots closest to Dale's property. "The pattern is unusual. The damage is concentrated on this side, and it appears to have moved inward over time. This looks like exposure to something that affected the root system." I looked toward Dale's house. He was still watching us, but now he wasn't standing as confidently as before. Evelyn continued examining the area near the fence line. Then she said something that I still remember clearly. "Whatever happened didn't happen overnight. This tree was being weakened for a while." That sentence stuck with me, because suddenly I wasn't just looking at a fallen tree anymore. I was looking at months of damage that nobody noticed. I was looking at a quiet battle that had been happening underground while everyone above the surface went about their lives. Evelyn finished her inspection and prepared a formal report. She included photographs, observations, dates, and her professional conclusion. The report didn't say Dale intentionally damaged the tree because proving someone's intent is a much bigger thing, but it clearly stated that the evidence pointed to chemical exposure originating from the side of the property where Dale lived. I thanked her, paid her fee, and sat in my truck for a few minutes afterward just processing everything. Part of me was angry. Another part of me was disappointed, because even though Dale and I were never close friends, we were still neighbors. There's supposed to be a basic level of respect between people who live next to each other. You're supposed to talk before accusing. You're supposed to ask questions before sending someone a bill. You're supposed to care about the truth more than winning an argument. That afternoon, I sent the report, along with photos of the damaged tree and Dale's repair estimate, to our homeowners association manager, Rachel Collins. Our HOA wasn't the most aggressive organization in the world, but they had rules about property boundaries, environmental damage, and anything that affected shared areas between homes. I honestly didn't know what would happen next. Maybe they would ignore it. Maybe they would say it was just a neighbor dispute and tell us to handle it ourselves. That's what I expected. But 2 days later, I heard a knock on my door. It was Rachel. She wasn't smiling. She was holding a folder. "We reviewed everything," she said, "and I think you're going to want to hear this." We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had stared at that $4,200 invoice just a few nights earlier. Rachel opened the folder and placed the report in front of her. "The arborist's findings are pretty clear," she said. "The tree did not fail because of neglect or natural decay alone. There is evidence of chemical damage." I nodded slowly. Then she said the words I had been waiting to hear. "Under our property maintenance rules, the person responsible for causing damage to a shared boundary or neighboring property can also be responsible for the resulting costs." The strange thing was, even in that moment, I didn't feel excited. I didn't feel like I had won. I just felt relieved, because finally, someone was looking at the facts instead of just pointing fingers. But the story wasn't over yet. Rachel told me the HOA would be sending a formal notice to Dale, and judging by the look on her face, I had a feeling that the $4,200 fence repair was about to become the smallest part of his problem. The HOA letter arrived at Dale's house 3 days later, and I wish I could have seen the look on his face when he opened it, not because I wanted to embarrass him, not because I wanted some dramatic victory moment where everyone in the neighborhood gathered around and watched him lose, but because after everything that happened, I was curious to see what someone does when the story they created suddenly stops going their way. Dale had been so confident from the beginning. He walked into my yard with that repair estimate in his hand like he was carrying a winning lottery ticket. In his mind, the case was already closed. The tree was mine. The fence was his, and somehow that meant I was automatically responsible. There was no investigation, no conversation, no curiosity about what actually happened. Just a conclusion. But that letter changed everything. According to the HOA review, the evidence showed that the tree did not simply collapse because it was old or because of a random storm. The arborist's findings pointed to chemical damage affecting the root system, with the pattern of damage starting near Dale's side of the property line. The report didn't accuse him of something it couldn't prove, and honestly, that was one thing I respected about Evelyn's work. She didn't write what people wanted to hear. She wrote what the evidence showed. That's the difference between an opinion and a professional conclusion. The HOA explained that because the damage originated from activity on Dale's side, his original claim for the $4,200 fence repair was denied. But they didn't stop there. The board also issued a violation notice because chemicals had been used near a shared boundary without approval, something the neighborhood rules specifically addressed. Dale was fined $1,000, and he was responsible for the $825 environmental inspection fee. Then came the part that probably hurt his pride more than anything else. He had to replace the fence himself, the same fence he had pointed at while demanding that I write him a check, the same fence he used as proof that I was somehow the problem. Now he was standing there with the bill in his own hands. I heard from another neighbor that Dale spent several days complaining about the HOA decision. He said the rules were unfair. He said everyone was against him. He said the arborist report didn't prove anything. And maybe part of him truly believed that. Sometimes people hold on to their version of events because admitting they were wrong means admitting they acted unfairly, and that's a hard thing for anyone to do. It's much easier to say, everyone else misunderstood me than to say, maybe I handled that badly. A few days after the decision, I finally saw Dale outside replacing the fence. I was walking back from my mailbox when he looked up and noticed me. For a second, I thought he was going to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, maybe even just a simple, I guess we both learned something. But he didn't. He just stared for a moment, gave a small nod, and went back to work. And honestly, I think that silence said more than any argument could have. Because sometimes people don't admit they were wrong with words. Sometimes they admit it by no longer fighting. The funny thing is, after all the tension, after the accusations and the paperwork and the meetings, the neighborhood didn't turn into some giant battlefield like I expected. Nobody picked sides. Nobody started gossiping. Every time someone walked outside, life just moved on. The fence was repaired. The tree was gone. The argument slowly became another story people mentioned when they talked about strange things that happened between neighbors. But for me, the biggest change wasn't what happened to Dale. It was what happened inside my own mind. Before this, I was the kind of person who assumed people generally meant well. If there was a problem, I believed a conversation could solve it, and I still believe that. But I also learned something important. Being a good neighbor doesn't mean letting someone else rewrite the truth just because they're more confident when they tell their version. You can be calm and still stand your ground. You can be respectful and still defend yourself. You don't have to create a war, but you also don't have to surrender just because someone else speaks louder. About a month after everything was settled, I planted a new red oak where the old one had stood. It was only about 10 feet tall. Nothing compared to the giant tree that used to fill that space. When I first put it in the ground, it almost looked a little ridiculous. I remember stepping back and thinking, you have a long way to go. But maybe that was exactly why I liked it. The old oak represented years of memories, but the new one represented starting over. It reminded me that not everything damaged is destroyed forever. Some things can grow again if you give them right conditions. Every spring when I see those first little leaves appear, I think about that whole experience. I think about how a tree can look perfectly fine on the outside while something serious is happening underneath. And honestly, people can be the same way. Sometimes the biggest problems don't begin with a loud argument. They begin quietly, with resentment, assumptions, and decisions made without knowing the full story. Looking back now, I don't hate Dale. I don't even really feel angry anymore. I think what happened was a lesson for both of us. He learned that accusations without evidence can come back around. I learned that sometimes you have to protect yourself, even when you wish you didn't have to. The $4,200 fence was never really the point. The money was just the surface. The real issue was whether the truth mattered when someone had already decided who was guilty. And in the end, that's what made the difference. Not anger, not revenge, not trying to hurt someone back, just facts, patience, and letting the evidence speak for itself. But I want to know what you think. If you were standing in my shoes and your neighbor demanded thousands of dollars from you before even knowing what happened, would you have fought back the same way? Would you have called an expert? Or would you have tried to work it out privately first? And what about Dale? Do you think he deserved the fines and the repair costs? Or do you think this was just a tragic accident that got handled the wrong way? Tell me your opinion in the comments because neighborhood disputes like this are never as simple as they look from the outside. There's always another side, another detail, another piece of the story that changes everything. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who loves real-life conflicts, unexpected twists, and those moments when the truth finally catches up with the person who thought they had already won. Because sometimes the strongest comeback isn't a loud one. Sometimes it's just standing there, calmly holding the proof.